I wear lipstick, I wear strength, I wear silence, but I never wear jealousy, she whispered. And that was the moment her billionaire husband realized he had underestimated her for the last time. Welcome to tonight's story, where betrayal, power, and elegance collide in a way you won't forget. Where are you tuning in from? Drop your country in the comments, and before you predict how this ends, ask yourself, what would you do if your best friend were secretly sleeping with your husband for 2 years? If you're into stories where the woman doesn't fall apart but rises with a plan, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe to catch our next episode, and don't forget to leave a comment if you saw that twist coming. Stay with us to the end, because when she finally smiles, you'll understand why revenge served cold is still red hot. The room smelled like white roses and aged wine. A soft piano played somewhere near the bar, and the amber glow of crystal chandeliers bathed the tables in honeyed light. Couples murmured over filet mignon and oysters, laughter rising like bubbles in champagne flutes. At the far corner of the restaurant, at their favorite table by the window, Yana Monroe sat across from her husband, Frederick Langston, the billionaire who could silence a room with just his last name. She looked flawless as always, her deep, glowing skin catching candlelight like silk. Her lips the perfect shade of red, not a single strand of her black, sleek hair out of place. She wore a dress that whispered power, elegance, and control. And yet, the air between them felt colder than the glass of Pinot Gris sweating on the table. She took a slow sip, eyes steady, while Frederick stared at her like a man about to execute a transaction, not celebrate 10 years of marriage. "I've never loved you," Frederick said, his voice smooth but sharp, like glass wrapped in velvet. "You've disgusted me since day one." His words didn't tremble. They landed heavy and deliberate, and the crystal stem of Shiana's wine glass trembled slightly between her fingers. But not because she was shocked. She blinked once, tilted her head slightly, and smiled. That same calm, unreadable smile she always wore when clients underestimated her in boardrooms. Around them, forks clinked, couples laughed, and life moved on. No one realized a marriage was unraveling, thread by thread, right in front of the creme brulee. "You're leaving me tonight?" Shiana asked, her tone light, almost conversational, like they were discussing the weather. Not a betrayal. Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes locked on his with a quiet intensity that made Frederick shift slightly in his seat. "Because I wore the wrong shade of lipstick? Or because you're finally tired of pretending?" Frederick scoffed, leaned back, and adjusted his cufflinks, the platinum ones she had gifted him 5 anniversaries ago. "Because I can't do it anymore. Because Monica and I deserve to live without sneaking around. Because you—" He hesitated just a second. "You bore me, Shiana. You're a routine. Monica makes me feel alive." The name sat between them like poison in a glass of wine. Monica, Shiana's best friend since college. Maid of honor at their wedding. The woman who cried beside her at her father's funeral and held her hand during surgery. The same woman who'd hugged her in this very restaurant after Shiana made her first million. Shiana's smile widened, and for a moment Frederick hesitated. He had expected tears, rage, pleading. Instead, he got serenity. "How long?" she asked, still sipping her wine, still calm. "2 years," he replied, staring past her now, unable to meet her gaze. "2 years of being with someone who sees me. 2 years of happiness, something you've never given me." Chiana set her glass down with a grace so precise it was almost theatrical. Her fingers folded elegantly over the linen napkin in her lap as she leaned forward slightly. "You've rehearsed this, haven't you?" she asked softly, her voice silk and steel. "The speech, the timing, the public setting, so I wouldn't cause a scene." Frederick stiffened, but she didn't give him a chance to reply. "You chose our anniversary, Frederick. The date is engraved inside your wedding ring. The date I held sacred. You chose this moment not because it's honest, but because it would be easier for you if I broke down quietly, didn't you?" Frederick's face tightened, his jaw working as he tried to regain control of the narrative. "I didn't come here to fight," he muttered. "Then why are you swinging?" Chiana answered without missing a beat. "Because this is violence, not with fists but with history, with betrayal, with cowardice." She took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. "You think I'm going to crumble here, In front of your wine and your money and your lies? You think I'm the same woman who trusted you blindly?" Frederick leaned in now, a trace of anger under his smooth exterior. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm saying," Shiana whispered, her eyes never leaving his, "that you just detonated a bomb, and you have no idea what kind of battlefield you're standing on." The waiter approached then, eyes darting nervously between them, holding dessert menus neither of them wanted. He opened his mouth to ask a question, but Shiana gave him a look that sent him retreating without a word. "Smart man," she said softly, her attention returning to Frederick. "And what exactly do you think happens next? You walk out of here into her arms, I cry into a silk pillow for a week, then sign away half my life quietly?" "You'll make it easy," Frederick said, "because dragging this out benefits no one. You get the house, I keep the condo. We split the assets, we move on." Chiana laughed then, a soft musical sound that drew glances from nearby tables, though they couldn't hear a word. "You sweet, stupid man," she said, almost pitying him. "You think this is about stuff. You think this ends with clean papers and quiet goodbyes." She stood up slowly, deliberately, placing her napkin on the table like a final move in chess. She leaned down so only he could hear her next words. "You think I'm going to let you burn 10 years of my life and walk away with a lighter. But you don't know me at all, Frederick. I wear lipstick, not jealousy. I don't cry over betrayal. I plan for it." Then she straightened her back, her heels clicking against the polished floor like punctuation marks. She walked away from the table with the elegance of a queen leaving court, while Frederick sat frozen, haunted by the words he thought would free him. He looked down at the untouched dessert menu, then at the empty chair across from him. A tremor of something, fear maybe, passed through him. Because for the first time that night, he realized he hadn't won. He had just started a war. Rain whispered against the high windows of the Langston penthouse, casting faint shadows on the marble floor, as city lights flickered in the distance like nervous stars. Chiana stood in the center of the living room, still in the same crimson dress that had turned heads hours earlier, though now it felt more like armor than elegance. She had removed her heels at the door. She didn't want the echo of them announcing her presence to the empty walls. Silence clung to the space like fog, and in that silence Chiana moved with intention. There was no rage in her steps, no chaos in her hands, only precision. The calm of a woman who had foreseen this storm long before the first cloud darkened her sky. She walked past the untouched champagne bottle Frederick had delivered that morning with a card that read, "To a decade of love." The handwriting was so convincing she might have believed it if she hadn't already known that love had vacated this apartment long ago, quietly, like a thief in the night. Shiana turned down the hall and opened the discreet panel in the wall behind the library shelves. It revealed a narrow hidden compartment, one Frederick never noticed, because he'd never looked closely at anything she built. From within, she pulled a matte black lockbox and placed it carefully on the coffee table before her. The combination clicked open with the fluidity of memory, and the lid lifted to reveal a thick stack of labeled envelopes, USB drives, hard copies of screenshots, and a leather-bound notebook. She slid the notebook out and flipped it open to a page titled, "Pattern of Movement, Monica Shaw." There were dates, times, receipts, some from luxury hotels, others from private jet logs, each cross-referenced with Frederick's calendar and invoices from the personal assistant they shared, until Shiana fired her quietly. At the time, Frederick had shrugged and said it was over-personal. He didn't ask questions because he never suspected Shiana was already searching for answers. This hadn't started with a lipstick stain or a mysterious late meeting. It began with an instinct, an energy shift, the way Frederick flinched when Shiana touched his arm at charity galas, or how Monica had stopped sharing things that didn't matter, because people stop offering you trivia when they're afraid of slipping the truth. Kiana had trusted her gut long before she had evidence, and when the truth finally started to show its teeth, she welcomed it with cold patience. Her revenge didn't grow out of fury, it bloomed in the quiet hours of the night, with spreadsheets, burner phones, and anonymous inquiries to private investigators whose loyalty could be bought by retainer and silence. She picked up one of the USB drives and slid it into her laptop, watching as folders sprang to life. Each named meticulously, Madeline Shaw, Hotel records, Langston transactions, questionable, flight logs overlap, surveillance Lowry Hotel. Every piece of information had its place, like tiles in a mosaic she had crafted with ruthless precision. She leaned back into the sofa and closed her eyes briefly, not out of exhaustion, but reflection. She didn't feel broken, just sharper. She had learned early on that people don't expect grace to become strategy, and that was her greatest weapon. No one ever saw her coming. The apartment still smelled faintly of Frederick's cologne, some overpriced blend of oak and citrus he wore like armor. But his scent couldn't hide the rot underneath, and now that rot had names, numbers, timestamps. Shiana opened her phone and scrolled through a contact saved under the name Lucille, though there was nothing grandmotherly about the person behind it. Lucille was the private investigator who had provided Shiana with everything. The photos of Frederick and Monica leaving a private villa in Turks and Caicos, the deleted messages from a synced device Frederick thought had been wiped, even the shady cash transfers to a shell company Madeline Shaw had created months after falling in love. A vibration interrupted the room's quiet. A message from Grant Peterson, the divorce attorney she had hired weeks ago. Confirmation, our meeting is set. Everything is ready. She didn't reply. She just stared at the message until it dimmed, then set the phone face down. There was no rush. She would not act out of impulse, not now. Frederick had played his final move at dinner, but she had been preparing for the endgame. He thought his betrayal made him powerful. He hadn't yet realized he had handed her the matchbook and stood in gasoline. Shiana walked to the bedroom and pulled open the drawer on her side of the bed. Beneath a silk nightgown, she retrieved a velvet pouch containing a single platinum ring, Frederick's wedding band, the one he had taken off after their fight 2 weeks ago and left on the counter like a forgotten receipt. She rolled it in her palm, feeling its weight, remembering the promises engraved inside. Until the end, it said. She laughed softly without humor, then whispered, "You should have known. I never forget an ending. I write it." She placed the ring back in the pouch and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, not out of sentiment, but because it would serve as physical proof that some endings begin long before they are spoken aloud. Her reflection caught in the window, a silhouette against the rain-soaked city, eyes sharper than diamonds, lips still painted in war paint red. The storm had been building for months, quiet and patient, just like her. Tonight wasn't devastating. It was a detonation. She didn't turn off the lights as she walked toward the study. She wanted the walls to remember her this way, composed, powerful, already steps ahead. She wanted the air to echo with silence, not of heartbreak, but calculation. And above all, she wanted Frederick to realize, too late, that while he had been busy chasing thrill in someone else's shadow, the woman he left behind had already mastered the dark. The elevator doors glided open onto the 26th floor of an old red brick building that smelled faintly of leather, mahogany, and old power. Shiana stepped out, her heels barely making a sound against the dark oak floor, as if even the space understood discretion was sacred here. A receptionist behind frosted glass gave her a polite nod and buzzed her through without a word. She walked down a narrow hallway lined with oil paintings of courtroom victories and framed newspaper clippings, headlines like "Peterson crushes tech mogul in historic divorce" and "The attorney no billionaire wants to face in court." She had chosen this man for a reason. Grant Peterson didn't just win, he dismantled. And tonight, Shiana wasn't looking for justice. She was ready for blood. Inside the office, Grant stood to greet her with the same stoic professionalism he was known for. Mid-50s, sharp suit, eyes like steel traps, he motioned toward a leather chair across from his desk, and Shiana sat without a word. She opened her briefcase and began placing items on the table, one by one, in a rhythm of power: printed emails, credit card statements, travel itineraries, screen captures, a USB drive marked only with a single word: truth. Grant didn't interrupt, didn't feign surprise. He merely leaned forward slightly, scanning what lay before him as if preparing for war, and then he finally spoke. "How long have you been building this?" Shiana's voice was calm, measured, but with an edge beneath the surface like frost on steel. "Long enough to know Frederick thinks he's 10 moves ahead, when in fact he's already in checkmate." Peterson flipped open the leather folder she handed him, eyes scanning the first 2 pages before letting out a low whistle through his teeth. "You've done your homework," he said, almost impressed. "And then some." She said nothing. There was nothing to prove anymore. She hadn't come here for praise. She came for execution. Grant leaned back and laced his fingers together. "You're sitting on evidence of financial misconduct, potentially even embezzlement. You realize this is bigger than divorce, yes? This could trigger an audit, if not a criminal investigation." Shiana nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." Grant's expression changed then, not out of concern, but calculation. He liked clients who didn't flinch. He liked women who walked into his office with a strategy instead of sob stories. "You said 50 million?" he asked. Shiana opened her phone, tapped a few times, and slid it across the desk. On the screen was a spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and suspicious wire transfers traced to accounts in Monaco and the Cayman Islands. Shell corporations with Monica Shaw's name buried 2 layers beneath. The funds are being rerouted through shell companies. He thinks no one has noticed. But I had a friend in digital forensics pull metadata on the documents. Everything leads back to Langston Capital. She paused, then added, "And to her." There was silence for a moment, not the awkward kind, but the kind that meant something dangerous was being considered. Grant tapped a pen against his palm thoughtfully. "If this gets out before we file, his team will bury or freeze assets. But if we move first, with the right court order, we can lock everything down and catch him with his pants around his ankles." He opened a drawer, pulling out a blank legal intake form and sliding it toward her. "We'll go for dissolution with cause, petition for asset protection, and request discovery access to his full financial portfolio. It'll hit him like a freight train." Shiana reached for the pen and signed without hesitation. "Tell me about the apartment in Milan," Grant said casually as he reviewed the documents. "It's in her name," Shiana replied. "But the payments come from a consulting firm that Frederick claims is inactive. I've tracked every dollar. He didn't even try to hide it cleverly. Just arrogantly." Her tone wasn't bitter, just exhausted from how predictable the betrayal had been. Grant nodded slowly. "Then we'll subpoena her too. If she thinks she's a bystander, she's in for a rude awakening." He looked up, meeting Shiana's eyes. "Are you prepared for what this becomes? Once it starts, it won't stop until everything's exposed. You'll be dragged through it too. They'll attack you." "I know," she said, folding her hands on her lap. "But I've already lived through the worst part. Now it's their turn." Grant smiled, not kindly, but with the kind of approval forged in war rooms and court battles. He stood and reached for a bottle of water, handing it to her like a gesture of solidarity. "I'll have my team file by morning, but we won't just hit them with paperwork. We'll tie it to timing. You said there's an internal audit happening at his company soon?" Shiana's expression darkened slightly, her lips curving into something between a smirk and a vow. "Langston Capital's audit committee starts its quarterly review next week. I already confirmed it through one of the partners. The moment they open those books, they'll find the cracks. All we need to do is widen them." Grant sat back down and opened a calendar on his screen. "Then here's what we do. We file 2 days before the audit. It forces him into panic mode. He'll try to hide, reallocate, and delete. But we'll already have the injunction ready, and when he makes his first mistake, we catch him with both hands in the vault." Shiana nodded slowly, already picturing it unfolding. "Good. I want this to be clean. I want it to be undeniable. I don't want revenge, Grant. I want consequence." She stood collecting her documents, her bag, and her calm. "This is war," she said, more to herself than to him. "But it's one I've already won. They just don't know it yet." Grant walked her to the door, his voice the last sound she heard before it clicked shut behind her. "Frederick Langston is about to learn a lesson no man forgets. Never betray a woman who knows your passwords." Shiana didn't smile, didn't speak. She just stepped into the elevator, descended into the night, and disappeared into the storm she had summoned with her own hands. The cafe was tucked away on a quiet street, its windows steamed by the warmth inside, and the clink of ceramic cups echoing softly under the low hum of jazz. It was the kind of place people went to vanish for a few hours, to pretend the world outside couldn't touch them. Shiana chose it deliberately, Not too public to attract attention, but not too private to suggest secrecy. She sat at a corner table near the frosted window, her hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee gone cold. Across from her, a man she hadn't seen in years lowered his sunglasses and studied her with a mixture of nostalgia and quiet rage. Jackson Hale looked older, sharper, like a man who had learned that betrayal doesn't always arrive with a scream. It slips in like fog, stealing warmth before you even notice the cold. I figured it out 6 months ago, Jackson said, voice low and steady, like someone reciting a eulogy they'd rehearsed too many times. Monica started disappearing for entire weekends. Her explanations were polished, too polished. Shiana didn't flinch. She simply nodded, already knowing the pattern he described because she had lived through her own version of it. Different lies, same rhythm. Jackson leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. And when I finally checked her phone, God, I was so stupid. There they were. Messages, photos, hotel bookings, your husband, my fiancé, in bed, in Rome. Chiana's fingers didn't tighten around the cup, nor did her eyes flicker. She had heard this story before, just in different voices. She played both of us, she said, her tone even, but edged with something colder than anger. Frederick was just too arrogant to hide it. Monica? She was smarter. She knew exactly what to delete and when. Jackson laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair, eyes now burning with the sting of humiliation. She looked me in the eye, Yana. She made wedding plans with me, talked about kids, and the whole time she was screwing your husband behind our backs. Chiana placed her cup down carefully and met his gaze without blinking. They deserve each other, she said, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. Not sympathy, not shared sorrow, but a grim understanding of how two lives had been shattered by the same two people. I'm not here to talk about the past, she continued. I'm here to talk about what happens next. Jackson raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. And what exactly is next? Shiana reached into her bag and slid a flash drive across the table. On that is everything I've collected. Emails, wire transfers, surveillance photos. I know she helped him move the money. I know she created at least 2 of the shell companies. And I know she's not going to walk away clean. Jackson picked up the drive and turned it over in his hand, then looked back at her. So this is a team up, he said slowly. You and me against the happy couple. Yana gave him a look that was more steel than smile. I'm not asking for friendship, Jackson. I'm asking for a strategy. You have access to her circles, her clients, her associates. I need someone who knows how she operates behind closed doors. He nodded slowly, the weight of their mutual ruin sinking in. You know, I always thought I'd spend the rest of my life with her, he said quietly. Turns out I was just her alibi. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe drifting like static in the background. Then Jackson leaned forward, lowering his voice. I have a few things of my own, he said. Private voice recordings, notes from her meetings. She talks too much when she's drunk, and I've been listening for a while. Shiana's eyes gleamed slightly, not with delight, but with something sharper, anticipation. Good, she said. We use every piece, every angle. I want this airtight. I want her exposed, not just legally, but publicly. She built her reputation by selling empowerment to women. Let's show them who she is. Jackson gave a tight nod, as if sealing a pact. They won't see it coming, he murmured. Shiana allowed herself the briefest flicker of satisfaction. They never do, she replied. She stood, gathering her coat, the conversation complete. I'll be in touch. And Jackson? He looked up. This isn't about revenge, she said quietly. It's about truth. Let's not confuse the two. Then she walked away, leaving him at the table with the flash drive and a look that said he'd just agreed to join a war he didn't start, but fully intended to finish. Outside, the wind had picked up, tugging at her coat, but Shiana didn't feel the cold. She walked briskly through the city streets, her mind calculating moves like a chess master. Monica's PR firm, her influencer clients, the interviews she had done about female loyalty and empowerment. Shiana would let the truth eat through that image like acid. There would be no screaming, no social media rants, no public breakdowns. Just one precise cut after another until Monica stood in front of the world with no mask left to wear. That night, Shiana returned home and reopened her laptop, now with a new folder labeled Operation Shaw. She began sorting Jackson's audio files, cross-referencing Monica's voice with timestamps from Frederick's travel logs. Everything was falling into place, not because luck favored her, but because she refused to play defense. She had been watching them longer than they knew, and now that she had an ally who wanted answers as badly as she did, the house of lies they built would collapse under the weight of truth neither of them could control. The morning Langston Capital's internal audit began, Frederick woke to the smell of espresso and the faint rustle of documents being printed somewhere outside his office. His assistant, a bright, too efficient Ivy League graduate named Harper, was waiting in his private boardroom, pale-faced and a little too alert for this early in the day. Frederick barely acknowledged her presence as he strode past in a navy suit cut so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. His phone buzzed with back-to-back emails flagged with red exclamations. The subject lines all screamed the same thing: pre-audit irregularities, flagged transactions, inconsistencies in consultant payments. At first, he dismissed them as overreactions, but when Harper followed him into his office without waiting to be invited, clutching a file so tightly her knuckles turned white, he paused. "There's something you need to see," she said. Her voice wavered, but not from fear of him, more like fear of what she was holding. Frederick took the file, flipped it open, and scanned the first page. He froze mid-breath. The numbers didn't lie. Transfers he thought had been buried under layers of dummy corporations were showing up under high-risk flags. Names that were never meant to be linked, his, Monica's, the firm, were cross-referenced on at least 3 flagged reports. "How the hell did this get pulled?" he snapped. Harper hesitated. "New compliance software. Went live 2 weeks ago. It's catching patterns the old system missed." Frederick's throat tightened. He had timed everything so carefully, executed each move with the arrogance of someone who believed the system existed to protect people like him. But now the system had teeth, and it was biting. As he flipped through the rest of the file, his mind raced through possible explanations. He could blame a junior executive, claim ignorance, call it a mistake. But that wouldn't erase the trail. It was too late for cover-ups. What he needed now was leverage. He grabbed his phone and dialed Monica. She answered on the second ring, her voice breathy and impatient. "I'm in a meeting," she hissed. Frederick didn't care. "We have a problem," he said through clenched teeth. "The audit has started. They're finding things. Transfers, names, yours, mine." There was a sharp pause. "I thought you scrubbed it," she whispered. "So did I," he growled. "But someone fed them a thread, and now they're pulling the whole damn sweater." Monica cursed under her breath, but Frederick was already ending the call. He paced his office like a caged animal, every step slicing through the illusion of control he'd wrapped around himself for years. The timing was too perfect. The audit software update, the sudden emergence of flagged accounts, and the worst part, the divorce petition Shiana had filed 2 days earlier, with a request for asset injunction so detailed it felt surgical. That's when realization hit him like a freight train. She had planned this, not just the divorce, the audit, the exposure, all of it. He grabbed the divorce paperwork from his desk, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. The financial disclosures Shiana's lawyer submitted were unnervingly precise, like she already knew which assets would be frozen, which offshore accounts would raise red flags, which payments could be traced to Monica. The precision wasn't just legal, it was personal. It was the work of someone who had mapped his empire not to share it, but to burn it from the inside out. He slammed the file shut and barked at Harper to cancel his meetings. "Get Peterson on the line, now." Harper blinked. "Your wife's attorney?" Frederick turned to her slowly, realizing the slip. "No, I meant, damn it, get corporate counsel." By the time Frederick arrived at the emergency meeting with Langston Capital's audit committee, the air was thick with tension. The partners didn't rise to greet him. No handshakes, no smiles. Just narrowed eyes and printed reports spread like battle maps across the long mahogany table. "We've been reviewing the anomalies," one of them said, sliding a thick file toward him. There are significant inconsistencies tied to accounts you authorized. Some of them are linked to private real estate acquisitions, others to consulting firms that don't exist. Frederick kept his expression neutral, though his heart thundered behind his ribs like war drums. "I'll review this with my legal team," he said calmly. "It's likely a miscommunication between departments." But the senior partner wasn't having it. "It's more than miscommunication, Frederick. It's misconduct. And if we find you intentionally bypassed our compliance protocols, it won't just be your seat on this board you'll lose. It'll be your freedom." The words echoed like a verdict. Frederick nodded slowly, offered a clipped thanks, and walked out of the room without another word. His phone vibrated again. Another message from Monica. "What the hell is happening? Should I leave town?" He didn't respond. For the first time in his life, he didn't have an answer. Later that evening, alone in his penthouse office, Frederick stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city blink beneath him like an indifferent machine. He opened a hidden drawer in his desk and pulled out a USB-marked emergency exit. It contained contact info for lawyers, offshore backup accounts, and identity files. He had always been prepared for war, but not one waged by the woman he thought too tame to strike. His hands shook as he poured a drink, spilling bourbon onto the glass tabletop. Somewhere in the background, the news played softly. Another corporate giant under fire for fraud. Another reputation in flames. He muted it with one tap. He didn't need the reminder. He was next. And across the city, in a modest office filled with soft lamplight and walls covered in case files, Shiana sat with Grant Peterson, reviewing the day's audit fallout. Her expression was calm, her tone measured, but her eyes gleamed with cold fire. "He knows now," she said simply. "Good," Grant replied. "Let him feel it. This isn't just divorce anymore. It's collapse." She nodded, sipping tea from a mug that read, "No mercy, just math." Because in her world, justice wasn't a hope. It was a calculation. And Frederick Langston had just learned he was the wrong variable in the wrong equation. The knock came at dawn, 3 sharp, deliberate raps against the heavy glass of Frederick Langston's penthouse door. He was still in his robe, hair unkempt and eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night filled with contingency plans that unraveled faster than he could rebuild them. When he opened the door, 2 men in dark suits stood there with federal badges raised and expressions that held no curiosity, only confirmation. "Mr. Langston, you are under investigation for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of financial compliance," one said. "We need you to come with us." The hallway behind them was quiet, but the sound of the words was deafening. Frederick opened his mouth to object, to posture, to delay, but instead he reached for the nearest shirt, said nothing, and followed them out without resistance. The cuffs clicked shut behind him inside the elevator, the stainless steel walls reflecting a man who no longer looked like a billionaire, but rather like a defendant. His neighbors, those who once greeted him with admiration and envy, watched silently as he was escorted past them. No one spoke. No one defended him, because no one had to. The headlines had already done the talking. Langston Capital's CEO detained amid multi-million-dollar fraud scandal. The elevator doors closed, sealing in his shame. Down at the precinct, he was processed with clinical efficiency. Fingerprints, mugshot, belongings are in a tray. He was offered a lawyer but waved it off. He needed time to think more than he needed someone to spin the truth. In the holding room, he stared at the wall while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like broken promises. He kept replaying the last month in his mind, trying to find the moment it had all turned against him. But no matter how far back he searched, the answer came back to the same place. Shiana. She hadn't just left him. She had dismantled him. Hours later, as dusk painted the skyline in bruised shades of blue, he sat across from federal investigators, posture rigid, jaw clenched. "You were aware these funds were transferred under your name?" one agent asked, sliding a document forward. Frederick scanned it, then nodded slowly. "Yes." Another file was pushed toward him. "And these accounts in Madeline Shaw's name. Were you aware they were receiving payments directly tied to your offshore holdings?" Frederick paused longer this time. Not in detail," he said, the words catching in his throat. "She handled that side." The agents exchanged a glance. "So you're saying you weren't in control of your financial activity?" I'm saying I trusted someone I shouldn't have, Frederick snapped, his patience cracking. Madeline advised me. She set up the consulting pathways. She told me how to avoid unnecessary scrutiny. He exhaled sharply, then added with more venom than regret. She said it was normal. That's how people like us stay ahead. The agents didn't respond immediately. They simply made notes and slid another file into the growing pile. His deflection had been subtle, practiced, but the room didn't feel any less suffocating. Later that evening, as he sat in a dim, single-bulb cell, his phone call was finally granted. He dialed Shiana's number from memory, not because he believed she would help, but because some part of him still couldn't accept how fully she had severed him from her world. The line rang twice before she answered. No greeting, just silence, poised and deliberate. Shiana, he began, voice low, edged with something between shame and desperation. I'm in trouble. She didn't speak. He continued. They have everything, the accounts, the transfers. They think I was laundering. You know I'm not stupid enough to try that. Still, she said nothing. He swallowed hard, then added, It was her. Madeline pushed for the structure. She said it was discreet. I should have questioned it, but I didn't. I let her handle it. Her voice, when it finally came, was quiet and razor-sharp. You didn't let her handle it. You chose convenience over integrity. You chose betrayal over truth, and now you're choosing blame over accountability. Frederick flinched, more from the accuracy than the sting. I didn't call to fight, he said, lowering his voice. I called because I need your help. You know how this works. You know how fast it can spiral. There was a pause, then she said, I do know. That's why I planned for it. Silence thickened between them. I'm not your lifeline, Frederick. I'm the reason you're drowning. She ended the call before he could say another word. Back at her townhouse, Shiana sat in her reading chair, phone resting on the armrest like an afterthought. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, indifferent to who fell or rose within it. She took a slow sip of tea, her breath steady. She hadn't cried. Not for the marriage, not for the betrayal, and certainly not for the man who was now watching his world collapse from behind iron bars. It wasn't satisfaction she felt, it was justice. Frederick had written her off as the quiet, well-dressed accessory to his empire. But now he understood. She had been the architect all along. And somewhere across town, Monica Shaw paced her apartment like a hunted animal. Her phone buzzed with media requests, former clients pulling out of contracts, and a dozen messages from unknown numbers asking for statements. She hadn't heard from Frederick since the arrest, and fear crept in like rot. For the first time, the woman who had always performed control for a living was realizing she was no longer the director of her own show. And worse, Shiana Monroe had just taken center stage. The empire was falling, brick by brick, and no one would forget who lit the match. Monica Shaw sat in front of her vanity mirror, staring at her reflection like it was a stranger. Her makeup was flawless, as always, but her eyes, calculating, camera-ready eyes, were restless. She had spent her entire career sculpting an image of empowerment, a woman who built women, who preached loyalty and polished ambition like a virtue. But the glow of her reputation was beginning to flicker, and beneath the surface the foundation was cracking. Every click of her phone was another reminder that control was slipping from her hands. Clients were ghosting her. Sponsors were freezing deals. Influencers who once begged for a seat at her table were suddenly restructuring their partnerships. And worst of all, Jackson Hale, her ex-fiancé, had gone silent, which was more dangerous than any public accusation. She scrolled through her DMs with a twitch of her finger, watching the messages pile up. Journalists were circling like vultures disguised as fans, all asking the same veiled question. Did you know? Of course she knew. She helped build the shell companies. She coached Frederick through his privacy protocols. She was in the room for most of it, but she never expected it to fall apart so fast, and she certainly didn't expect Shiana to be behind the unraveling. That woman had always been too composed, too quiet, too trusting. Monica never imagined she'd be capable of vengeance wrapped in such elegance. And now it seemed the silence Shiana had carried for months was no longer passive, it was preparation. Across the city, in a private recording studio tucked behind a co-working space, Jackson leaned into the mic and hit record. His voice was calm but firm, like a man who'd been betrayed not once, but twice, and wasn't interested in healing, only revealing. "She lied to me," he said into the dark foam, "and while she whispered love in my ear, she was funneling money into offshore accounts with a man married to her best friend." His podcast had always drawn a loyal, quiet following: startups, entrepreneurs, burned-out CEOs. But this episode, coded simply as The Betrayal, was going to be different. This one had names, dates, receipts. Jackson had everything he needed: the photos Shiana had shared with him, the voice recordings Monica had left on his voicemail while drunk. Laughing about how stupid everyone around her was, calling Shiana a doormat in designer heels. He didn't rage on air. He didn't curse. He simply laid out the truth like a surgeon exposing a tumor, one layer at a time. He didn't say Monica's name at first, but by the 15-minute mark, he no longer needed to. Her voice, her words, her laughter were playing across streaming platforms, her secrets cascading into the public like an avalanche she could no longer outrun. By nightfall, Monica's name was trending, but not in the way she was used to. There were hashtags, reaction videos, threads dissecting her rise and fall. Screenshots from the podcast flew across social media like wildfire. Influencer exposés cropped up overnight, with old collaborators stepping forward, finally emboldened to admit that behind the scenes, Monica Shaw had been ruthless, exploitative, and, now undeniably, complicit in Frederick Langston's crimes. Still, Monica didn't cry. She didn't panic. She did what she always did. She pivoted. She filmed a video in soft lighting, sitting cross-legged on a velvet couch, voice low, eyes heavy with mock sincerity. "I was manipulated," she began, "by someone I loved and trusted." She painted herself as another victim of Frederick's charm, claiming she did not know about financial misconduct. "I believed in Shiana too," she said, placing a trembling hand to her chest. "And if I hurt her, I'm deeply sorry. But I was lied to. We both were." Her followers split down the middle. Some clung to the image of Monica the mentor, the self-made queen of authenticity. Others had seen enough. The internet, once her empire, now shifted beneath her feet like sand. Back in her office, Shiana watched the video without flinching. Grant Peterson sat beside her, sipping black coffee, shaking his head slowly. "She's going to drag you in next," he said. "It's the only card she has left." Shiana nodded, never taking her eyes off the screen. "Let her," she said. "I've built my defense with facts. She's building hers with fiction." Sure enough, by morning, Monica's legal team had issued a statement suggesting that Shiana may have been unwittingly involved in Frederick's financial structures. The language was careful, the kind designed to plant seeds without claiming responsibility. But the seeds never took root, because Shiana had anticipated them. She released a short video of her own. Not glamorous, not heavily produced. Just her in a plain room, holding a folder of documents. She didn't cry. She didn't accuse. She simply laid out the timeline. She showed bank statements, private messages, corporate filings. Every word was backed with evidence. And then she ended it with a line that broke the internet. "When a woman stops defending her name and starts defending the truth, people start listening differently." The tide turned almost instantly. Monica's story unraveled under the weight of Shiana's receipts. Forensic analysts picked apart her claims and proved that several of the corroborating messages she'd shared were fabricated. Digital footprints didn't lie, and Monica, despite her PR talent, had left behind a trail of inconsistencies. Within hours, authorities confirmed that Monica was under investigation for obstruction of justice and identity manipulation. One of her former employees leaked emails showing she'd asked him to alter timestamps and create dummy accounts. The illusion had shattered. In the quiet that followed, Monica sat alone in her penthouse, makeup smeared, phone silent. No more texts, no more interviews. The silence she had once wielded as power had turned against her. Because silence, she learned too late, was Shiana's language, and Shiana had spoken it better. Across the city, Shiana closed her laptop, her expression unreadable, her posture still. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't done. This wasn't revenge. This was exposure. And the difference between the two was simple. Revenge is emotional. Exposure is inevitable. The courtroom was colder than Shiana expected, not because of the temperature, but because of the eyes watching her. Press, lawyers, former colleagues, investors, even strangers who once praised her now sat silently, waiting to see whether she would crack. But Kenna Monroe didn't flinch. Dressed in tailored navy, her posture erect and voice unshakable, she took the stand with the calm authority of a woman who no longer lived in the shadow of someone else's empire. This wasn't a trial about heartbreak. It was about accountability. And if Frederick Langston thought he could use the courtroom to twist her narrative, he hadn't been paying attention to the woman he used to call predictable. Across the room, Frederick looked like a ghost of the man who once controlled billion-dollar deals with a single nod. His tailored suit hung looser now, and the fire behind his gaze had dulled to a flicker. Still, he tried to wear the mask, the confident smirk, the casual arrogance. But it fell apart every time Shiana spoke. With every document presented, with every answer she gave, the jury saw not just evidence of a broken marriage, but of a broken man who believed power exempted him from consequence. She didn't raise her voice, didn't lash out. She simply told the truth. And the truth in that room was the most damning testimony of all. When her cross-examination ended, Shiana returned to her seat beside Grant Peterson. He leaned toward her and whispered, "You just buried him, and you never even raised your tone." She gave a slight nod, eyes never leaving Frederick, who now avoided looking at her altogether. Then came Monica's turn. She had attempted to file a motion to avoid testifying, citing harassment and public scrutiny, but the court had denied it. When she entered the room, her heels clicked a little too loudly, and her carefully curated expression cracked at the corners. The camera lights, once her allies, now felt like threats. On the stand, Monica tried to control the story. She called herself a woman manipulated, insisted she was unaware of the true nature of the financial schemes, and claimed that her role had been purely administrative. But the prosecution was armed with more than hearsay. They had emails. They had call logs. They had audio from Jackson's recordings that showed not just awareness, but strategy. Her words began to contradict themselves. She stuttered. She blamed. She panicked. And when asked directly if she had ever falsified financial records, she hesitated just long enough to make the silence damning. After the court recessed, Monica stormed through the courthouse corridor like a bomb in heels, flanked by two lawyers who whispered frantic reassurances she no longer believed. Outside, reporters swarmed, and she issued a shaky statement about respecting the legal process. But inside her head, she knew the tide had turned. Her empire was no longer bleeding. It was imploding. And the woman she had once mocked for being too quiet had become the voice that tore her down. Back in the privacy of her home, Kiana stood before the large bay windows, watching the city flicker beneath her. She wasn't celebrating. She didn't believe in premature victories, but for the first time in months, the air felt breathable again. Grant's voice broke through her thoughts as he called to give the latest update. Monica had been officially charged with obstruction, falsifying documents, and tampering with digital evidence. Her bail had been posted, but the DA was confident a conviction was inevitable. Shiana listened silently, then thanked him. When she ended the call, she closed her eyes, not from fatigue, but from release. Later that evening, Frederick requested to speak with her, not through lawyers, not on paper, in person. Against Grant's advice, Shiana agreed, on the condition that it happen in a monitored mediation room with legal oversight and cameras rolling. She didn't trust him, but she wanted him to say it while someone else was listening. When he arrived, he looked tired in a way she didn't recognize. Not physically, but spiritually, like a man who finally understood the cost of his illusions. "I messed up," he said, barely above a whisper. "I lost everything." Shiana didn't respond immediately. She waited, letting him sit in the silence he had forced her to live in for years. "Monica set me up, or maybe I let her. I don't even know anymore." Shiana folded her arms. "You chose her, over me, over integrity, over the life we built." Frederick's eyes reddened, though no tears came. "I didn't think you'd fight back," he admitted. "You always seemed too graceful to burn things down." Her voice was steady when she replied, "Grace isn't weakness, Frederick. It's control, and you never realized I could hold fire without showing the flame." He leaned forward, desperation leaking through his words. "Can you forgive me?" Shiana didn't blink. "Forgiveness isn't part of this process. Accountability is." She stood then, her figure outlined by the soft glow from the hallway outside. "You wanted freedom. Now you have it. But freedom without truth is just exile." She left the room before he could speak again, heels echoing down the corridor like punctuation marks to a sentence he'd never get to finish. That night, Shiana stood on her balcony, the wind teasing strands of her hair, the city stretching endlessly below. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't even a survivor. She was something else entirely, a woman who had faced betrayal, devoured silence, and learned to turn scars into strategy. And in doing so, she had transformed pain into power and vengeance into consequence. The day the final ruling came down, the courtroom was still, heavy with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Kiana Monroe sat poised in the front row, not with the tension of someone hoping for justice, but with the steadiness of someone who had already made peace with the outcome. The judge's voice rang clear as he delivered the verdict. Frederick Langston was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for corporate fraud, wire transfers in violation of international banking laws, and deliberate obstruction of regulatory oversight. Monica Shaw, in a separate trial concluded days earlier, had been sentenced to 18 months for falsifying evidence and identity theft. When the gavel came down, it echoed like a door slamming shut on a chapter soaked in betrayal. Shiana didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply closed her notebook, stood with quiet grace, and walked out of the courtroom for the last time. Outside, reporters swarmed like moths to flame, but she moved through them with the kind of presence that required no bodyguards, just conviction. Questions were shouted about Frederick, about Monica, about how she had orchestrated it all without ever breaking down. But she didn't stop. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been proven in court, in evidence, in consequence. In the weeks that followed, the world slowly stopped saying her name like it was part of a scandal. The narrative shifted. She was no longer the betrayed wife or the polished victim. She became a symbol of resilience, not the kind found in whispered affirmations, but the kind forged in the fire of strategic survival. Offers came in from publishers, networks, and conferences. Everyone wanted to hear her story. They wanted the blueprint for how she'd gone from quiet socialite to the woman who dismantled a billionaire and exposed a beloved influencer. But Shiana didn't rush to capitalize on the moment. She took her time because the version of herself that had survived this war needed space to become someone entirely new. She moved out of the penthouse she once shared with Frederick and into a modern townhouse tucked behind a row of magnolia trees. Unassuming, peaceful, hers. The walls were white, not sterile but open, like the first page of a new chapter waiting to be written. She kept very few mementos. A single frame photo of her late grandmother sat by the window, along with a journal filled with handwritten reflections. Shiana didn't need reminders of what she'd endured. She needed space for who she was becoming. One morning, as sunlight spilled into her kitchen, she brewed a cup of coffee and opened a letter from her attorney. The finalization of her divorce had gone through quietly. Assets had been divided, titles reassigned, and all of Frederick's attempts to negotiate for leniency had been denied. She was now the sole beneficiary of their charitable foundation, which she promptly renamed the Monroe Initiative, focused on supporting women leaving high-profile, abusive, or exploitative relationships, especially those who lacked the legal resources to protect themselves. It wasn't charity, it was a legacy, and this time, it bore her name alone. Later that day, she met Jackson Hale at a bookstore cafe downtown. He looked different, lighter somehow, though his eyes still carried the shadows of what they'd both endured. He handed her a copy of his newly published book, a memoir that chronicled not just the betrayal, but the transformation that came afterward. Inside the cover, he had written, "For Q, who reminded me that silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's just the sound of a storm preparing to speak." She smiled at that, not sentimentally, but with acknowledgement. They didn't talk about Monica or Frederick. They talked about rebuilding, about the lives they were choosing now, not the ones they'd been forced to survive. That evening, Shiana sat on her balcony, a soft breeze curling around her as she scrolled through messages from women she'd never met. They wrote about survival, about waking up, about finally leaving relationships that had drained the light out of them. She read every word, not because she needed validation, but because she understood what it meant to feel alone in your truth. She replied to each one, not with advice, but with one sentence that had carried her through the darkest months. You are not what they did to you. You are what you decide to become next. In the mirror that night, Shiana studied her reflection, not with criticism, not with vanity, but with recognition. Her skin was still soft, her eyes still sharp, but there was something deeper now, a steadiness, a knowing. She applied her favorite lipstick, bold red, like always, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't armor. It was a celebration. Because she hadn't just survived the betrayal, she had rewritten the ending. The world would go on, new stories would trend, names would rise and fall in the public eye. But Shiana Monroe would never again be mistaken for background. She had stepped into the fire and walked out holding the match. And in the silence of her home, as the night settled softly around her, she whispered not a vow, but a promise to herself. The next chapter will be written in my voice, at my pace, on my terms. And that, more than anything, was the true beginning. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of betrayal, resilience, and reinvention. If Chiana's story moved you, challenged you, or simply made you think, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in her place? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that dares to go deeper, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that strength often speaks in silence. Until next time, thank you for listening, and we can't wait to see you in the next story.